Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and I call this channel all about Platonism. So each week I put out a new video looking at one of Plato's dialogues. And as you can see today, I'm talking about the dialogue Sophist. I started it last week. Last week I introduced some of the sophistical techniques that the stranger, as he's called in this dialogue, the main interlocutor, the sophistical techniques that he uses in his search for the definition of a sophist. So he's kind of functioning as a sophist, even as he's looking for the definition of a sophist. Now, what I'm going to look at today is what is arguably the most famous section of this dialogue, and that is Plato's discussion of being and not being. So here's the way it's introduced. So our stranger looking for the definition of sophist would make two categories. Let's call them A and B. And then he decide that the sophist is in B. And so then he would go there and then break that into two and keep going in this way. So at one point, he was looking at different types of imitators. And he calls them the likeness-making art and the fantastic art. Here's how he defined what he calls likeness-making art. And by the way, all of the translations that I'm using today are from Harold North Fowler. Okay, so he says, I see the likeness-making art as one part of imitation. This is met with as a rule whenever anyone produces imitation by following the proportions of the original in length, breadth, and depth, and giving besides the appropriate colors to each part. Okay, so trying to get as exact an imitation as possible. Now to this, we're going to get to the definition of fantastic art. To this, Theaetetus replies, yes, but don't all imitators try to do this? Don't they all try to imitate accurately? Well, the stranger replies, not those who produce some large work of sculpture or painting. For if they reproduce the true proportions of beautiful forms, the upper parts, would seem smaller and the lower parts larger than they ought, because we see the former from a distance and the latter from near at hand. Now, the only thing I can think of that might fit this description is looking at something very tall, like, say, the Statue of Liberty. The base looks very big, whereas the top is so far away that it looks small. But, of course, in that situation as well, you still have somewhat true proportions, or at least, the makers didn't make the top part huge so that it would look the same size or something. So I'm not really sure what he has in mind here. I think it's a bit more of his sophistry. But anyway, he calls this fantastic art, and he's able to make these two categories of imitators, those who produce accurately versus those who do not aim for true proportions. And then from here, he's able to go on a tangent. Now, we've already seen in other dialogues that Plato likes to use tangents as a way to give some of the main information that's in that dialogue. So while it's a tangent for the speakers in the dialogue, it's not a tangent for us, because this is where Plato gives us some of the most important points that he wants to make. And that's what he does here as well. So the stranger goes on to say, we're really, my dear friend, engaged in a very difficult investigation. For the matter of appearing and seeming, but not being, and of saying things but not true ones, all of this is now and always has been very perplexing. You see, Theaetetus, it is extremely difficult to understand how a man is to say or think that falsehood really exists, and in saying this, not to be involved in contradiction. Why? This statement involves the bold assumption that not being exists, for otherwise falsehood could not come into existence. So what he is saying here, we got to be careful here. In metaphysics, to exist sounds like it has being, it has absolute reality. He's not just saying that there is this thing called not being that somehow works its way into our realm of reality, but he's saying that there is an absolute reality, not being. Just as we talk about beauty itself or justice itself or greatness itself, not being itself. He's saying there must be not being itself, and that's why we have falsehood here in our realm of reality. So that's the case he's trying to make, and you can probably guess that there's a bit of sophistry here. This is not the conclusion we want to reach, but we'll see how he makes his argument. He says to Theaetetus, "Come, I beg of you, make a sturdy effort, young man as you are, and try with might and main to say something correctly about not being, without attributing to it either existence or unity or plurality." Now already maybe we're starting to see some of the sophistry. If you're familiar enough with the metaphysics of the Platonic tradition, you may recognize here that to attribute something to unity is a different realm of reality than what you'd attribute to plurality. And so already we can see a little bit of sophistry. He's just sort of lumping it all together. He goes on to say, "But again, false opinion will be that which thinks the opposite of reality, will it not?" Yes. "You mean then that false opinion thinks things which are not?" Necessarily. "Does it think that things which are not, or that things which are not at all in some sense are?" It must think that things which are not in some sense are. That is, if anyone is ever to think falsely at all, even in a slight degree. "And does it not also think that things which certainly are not at all?" Yes. "And this too is falsehood?" Yes, it is. "And therefore a statement will likewise be considered false if it declares that things which are not, or that things which are not are." Okay, so there he's clarifying what he means by a false statement. And now we see Theaetetus is a little confused here. He says, "Why, stranger, what can we say an image is, except another such thing fashioned in the likeness of the true one?" "Do you mean another such true one, or in what sense did you say such?" "Not a true one by any means, but only one like the true." "And by the true you mean that which really is?" "Exactly." "And the not true is the opposite of the true?" "Of course." "That which is like, then, you say does not really exist if you say it is not true." "But it does exist in a way." "But not truly, you mean?" "No, except that it is really a likeness." So we see here that Theaetetus is not quite accepting the stranger's conclusions. He has some understanding of the unfolding of reality through realms of likeness, but he is having some troubles here. He seems to be influenced by the stranger, but he also has some objections. And the stranger goes on to say that what we call a likeness, though not really existing, really does exist. And Theaetetus concludes that not being does seem to have got into some such entanglement with being, and it is very absurd. So we're seeing the difficulty here, that reality itself is what we say truly is, which means anything that is not reality itself, in some sense, is not. And what do you do with that? It is, and yet it is not. So what do you do with that? Well, the stranger, after creating some difficulties with not being, is now going to try to stir the pot about what we think being is. He says, "Perhaps our minds are in the same condition as regards being also. We may think that it is plain sailing and that we understand when the word being is used, although we're in difficulties about the term not being. Whereas the reality is that we understand equally little of both being and not being." From here, he's going to go into the difference between the Materialists and the Idealists. Now, this has come up in a few different dialogues, so I've talked about it in a few different videos. This may be review for some of you. For those of you new to my videos, this is a quick introduction to how Plato deals with Materialists versus Idealists. About the Materialists, he says this: "Some of them drag down everything from heaven and the invisible to earth, actually grasping rocks and trees with their hands. For they lay their hands on all such things and maintain stoutly that that alone exists which can be touched and handled. For they define existence and body or matter as identical. And if anyone says that anything else which has no body exists, Well, they despise that person utterly and will not listen to any other theory than their own. So this is the idea of materialism. Now, of course, they don't actually drag down everything from heaven because they don't think heaven even exists. They only focus on the physical world. If you can touch it, it's real. If you can't, it's not real. And then there's the idealists. Those who contend against the materialists will have to defend themselves very cautiously. They use weapons derived from the invisible world above, maintaining forcibly that real existence consists of certain ideas. This is more like mind stuff, not concepts. Certain ideas which are only conceived by the mind and have no body. But the bodies of their opponents, in that which is called by them to be truth, that they break up into small fragments in their arguments, calling them not existence, but a kind of generation combined with motion. I'm going to come back to this phrase, generation combined with motion. And he goes on to say that there is always, Theaetetus, a tremendous battle being fought between these questions, a tremendous battle being fought about these questions between the two parties, materialists and idealists. Okay, what are the idealists talking about? They're breaking up the realms of reality into being and becoming. Being is what truly is, the things in themselves. They're not physical, they're more like mind stuff, or what some traditions call consciousness. Whereas our physical world is a reflection of being. Being always is. It is eternal. It rests, it abides in itself, always in a state of rest, never changing. Whereas becoming, or our physical world, that's the generation combined with motion. It's the reflection of being that is always in flux, always coming into existence and going out of existence. It's called becoming because it never simply is. It's always in a constant state of motion, always becoming. And this brings them to this discussion of what academia calls the 5 genera of being, another very famous part of this dialogue. The 5 absolute realities that must be present for anything to exist, which is being, motion, rest, same, and other, or in some translations, difference. Here's how it's introduced. So the stranger is going to start with 3 of the 5. He's going to start with being, rest, and motion. And he says the most important of the absolute realities are the classes or genera are those which we just mentioned. Being itself, rest, and motion. He never does explain, by the way, why these 3. Yes, by far, Theaetetus agrees. And further, 2 of them, we say, cannot mingle with each other. Namely, that was rest and motion, because they're opposites. Decidedly not. But being can mingle with both of them, for they both are. So we see that that participation is not just a yes or no. It seems like, it is as he's arguing it here, is he says that rest and motion, he argues, do not participate in each other. I would take issue with that, but he's saying in this dialogue that rest and motion do not participate in each other, but both rest and motion participate in being because they both are. Now he wants to bring in same and other. Here's how he does it. Each of them is then other than the remaining 2, but the same as itself. But certainly motion and rest are neither other nor the same. So he has to show these 2 new ones that he brought in are separate genera. They're not synonymous with motion and they're not synonymous with rest. How so? Whatever term we apply to rest and motion in common cannot be either of those 2. Why not? Because motion would be at rest and rest would be in motion. In respect of both, for whichever of the 2 became other would force the other to change its nature into that of its opposite, since it would participate in its opposite. And then he goes on to look at being and the same. Are they synonymous? He says if being and the same have no difference in meaning, then when we go on and say that both rest and motion are, we shall be saying that they are both the same, since they are. But surely that's impossible. then it is impossible for being and the same to be one. Okay, so these are the kind of arguments he's making. Now we're going to look at the other. Is that a separate class? Shall we call the other a fifth class, or must we conceive of this and being as two names for one class? In other words, are they synonymous? Theaetetus says they may be, but I fancy you admit that among the entities, some are always conceived as absolute and some as relative. Now we got to be very careful here. There's sophistry here. Of course, Theaetetus says. And other is always relative to other, is it not? Yes. It would not be so if being and the other were not utterly different. If the other, like being, partook of both absolute and relative existence, there would be also among the others that exist another, not in relation to any other. But as it is, we find that whatever is other is just what it is through compulsion of some other. In other words, small is small because it's not large, or heavy is heavy because it's not light. That's the argument he's making, and you've got to ask yourself, is that always the case? If you accept that argument, then we may fearlessly persist in contending that motion is other than being? Yes, most fearlessly. It is clear then that motion really is not, and also that it is, since it partakes of being. And Theaetetus agrees that that is perfectly clear. Now, if it's not perfectly clear to you, don't feel bad, because it's not perfectly clear to me either. I think what Plato must have been doing with this dialogue is he was testing the students at his academy of how well do they understand the metaphysics that he'd been teaching them. Because the absolute realities, they always are. They exert a certain power. They have essence. They have a certain activity that is theirs. And so to say that motion sometimes is not, because it's different from being, is really just a conflation of everything that Plato taught. To say that things have to be opposite in order to be other is simply not accurate. So for example, a cat is not an apple, not because they're opposites, but because they're simply different. And to say that motion and being are not the same absolute reality does not mean that motion ever does not participate in being or ever is lacking essence. So this argument is really faulty, and so this is another example of sophistry. But our stranger goes on and says, in relation to motion then, not being is. That is inevitable, he claims. And this extends to all the classes, for in all of them the nature of other so operates as to make each one other than being, and therefore not being. So we may from this point of view rightly say of all of the alike that they are not, and again, since they partake of being, that they are and have being. Okay, so he's sort of toying with the whole idea of the nature of reality and what is the nature of the absolute realities in the intelligible. I think, again, Plato was probably testing his students, and by extension, he's testing us as well. He goes on to say that when we say not being, we speak, I think, not of something that is the opposite of being, but only of something different. So here he's finally giving us the answer. What do you mean? For instance, when we speak of a thing as not great, do we seem to you to mean by the expression what is small any more than what is of medium size? No, of course not. So now he's going to reverse what he just said. He says, then when we are told that the negative signifies the opposite, we shall not admit it. We shall admit only that the particle not indicates something different from the words to which it is prefixed, or rather from the things denoted by the words that follow the negative. So again, to say that a cat is not an apple really doesn't tell you a whole lot about what a cat is, does it? So it's not really telling us much. And they're not opposites. Now here is probably the single most famous line in the entire dialogue, and it gets quoted so very often. But now we understand that this is sophistry that Plato left for us to figure out. Shall we say that not being was and is not being, to be counted as one class among the many classes of being? Or have we, Theaetetus, any remaining distrust about the matter? Well, Theaetetus has none whatsoever. I can't say the same for me. Here's my problem with it, because we've seen in other dialogues this metaphysics of the realms of reality unfolding. What I'm calling here the intelligible realm, this is the realm that academia calls forms or ideas, what I've been calling absolute realities. The Greek is eidos. In the cave allegory, in the Republic, we saw this was the upper world. This was the goal for many people, or at least one of the goals along the way of gaining wisdom, is to experience absolute reality and to understand what it is. And we see that reality unfolds through realms. And here we have two other realms, the spiritual and the material. And as it unfolds, it has greater diffusion, which means that its power and its essence are diffused. So each realm operates at its own proper power, but each is good and right at its own proper power. And so what we see here is that we don't have to imagine not being existing in the intelligible. Instead, let's draw a line through it and say everything above is what we're going to call being, and everything below is what we're going to call becoming. Now, the spiritual realm is split in half because its essence is in being, but its activity as individual souls is in becoming. We're in time and space. And so what we're seeing here is that we don't have to imagine not being as an absolute reality in order for falsehood to exist in the realm of becoming. Instead, what we saw in the Republic and in other places as well is that as reality unfolds, it becomes increasingly more diffused, and its power is also more diffused. So it's functioning at a different power. And that's why falsehood is able to naturally work its way into the unfolding of reality. In the Republic, that was expressed through the divided line, which is from Book 6. And for those of you who have not seen my videos on the Republic, I do hope you'll watch them. I do present the Republic very differently from the way it's presented in most universities, so you're getting a very different look at how to read the Republic. And what we saw in Book 6 of the Republic was that these four cognitive functions really capture the breadth of the human experience. And what we find is that each of these realms, or each of these cognitive functions has as its object a metaphysical realm. And so the object of knowing is the intelligible realm, or the things in themselves, the absolute realities. Whereas in our realm of belief, in the world inside the cave, if you will, we saw that the object of the cognitive function of belief is our physical world. And so we see that the cognitive functions naturally become more diffused along with the unfolding of reality. And so there's a commensurate relationship between cognitive functions and metaphysical realms. And so we see that we don't have to imagine not being, having an absolute reality or being something we can know for falsehood to work into our physical realm. And then this is how he ends it. So here we can see that Plato was being tongue-in-cheek here and challenging us, because the stranger ends it by saying that if anybody has doubts about these oppositions, you have to make your own investigations and advance better doctrines than these of ours. He knows his doctrines were no good. And so the challenge is for us to better understand metaphysics. And that's really where we're going to leave the Sophists. But this discussion continues, because after looking for the Sophists, they have to go on to look for the statesman. And that's the next dialogue that supposedly takes place right after this conversation. And that's also the next dialogue that I am going to cover. So I do hope you will join me next week for that. And if you like what you saw here, please give it a thumbs up. That does help the algorithm and let other people see the video. And also, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below, or you can drop me an email. There's an email address in the description box. Okay, thank you very much, and I do hope you'll join me next week for The Statesman.